Hello historians, and welcome to the Unit 7.4 notes. Before we get started, I'd like you to take a look at the title of our notes, and I'd like you to notice that the word pre is missing from your title page. Please go ahead and add pre to the title of your notes because it's very important to keep in mind that these notes are going to be focusing on pre-World War II in the Pacific Theater. Meaning we're going to be looking at what was happening in the Pacific Ocean before World War II started. We've already talked about what happens in the European theater. In the Unit 7.1 notes, we looked at pre, meaning before World War II in the European theater. And then in the Unit 7.2 notes, we looked at what actually starts happening in Europe once World War II officially starts with the invasion of Poland by Hitler. Today, we're going to look at what's happening in the Pacific theater before World War II actually starts there. So let's go ahead and recap when did World War II start. Again, as we mentioned in the Unit 7.1 notes, most historians argue that it started in 1939 with Hitler's invasion of Poland, and we learned last lecture that Hitler used a very strategically strong tactic known as Blitzkrieg, which is a German word for lightning war. Now, even though most people agree that 1939's invasion of Poland was the start of World War II, some people believe World War II started 8 years earlier in 1931 with Japanese invasion of Manchuria, China. This Japanese invasion of Manchuria and China, along with some other Japanese aggressive actions, are going to be the focus of today's notes. If we take a look at our map, we'll be looking at what Japan was doing here in the Pacific Theater and how those actions were creating tension. Please note that since the world is round, the Pacific Theater not only takes place here on the Asian coast, but the Pacific Theater also wraps around and touches here on the western coast of the United States. Now, there are also some people who believe that World War II officially started in 1935 when Benito Mussolini, the totalitarian leader of Italy, started invading northeastern Africa, specifically the country of Ethiopia. So lots of different ideas, lots of different opinions on when World War II actually started, but we are going to focus on the popular date of 1939. All right. So this map here does a nice job of showing us where most of the main battles are going to be in the Pacific Theater. So if we take a look at our legend, we can see these little stars are showing us that many different battles take place in the Pacific. If we take a look at the arrows along the map, we can see that all of these arrows are pretty much moving eastward, kind of showing us that these battles are slowly progressing closer and closer to the island of Japan. Not only do we see ocean battles in the Pacific, but we also see territorial land battles in the Pacific, and these battles are also moving closer and closer to Japan. Today we'll be learning about why the Japanese Empire started committing aggressive actions in the Pacific Theater, which eventually led for it to be attacked piece by piece. Anytime that you see this flag, this is the flag that represents Imperial Japan. Remember that imperial means bullying, or imperialism means bullying. And so what we're going to find is that a lot of the aggressive actions that Japan does take pre-World War II are pretty much imperial actions, meaning aggressive bullying actions. So what were some of Japan's wants? Like its Axis power allies, Japan wanted to create an empire for itself by practicing imperialism. If you don't remember who the Axis powers are, you want to annotate this now. The Axis powers were Japan, Germany, and Italy. So we already talked about how Germany was practicing imperialism, taking Austria, taking the Sudetenland, taking Poland, and eventually taking almost all of Europe. We haven't talked too much about Italy's imperialism, but we'll get to that next week. All you need to know for today is that these three Axis power countries, Germany, Italy, and Japan, are practicing imperialism. Now, Japan is going to believe that the use of its imperialism, meaning the use of its bullying tactics, are justified, meaning correct or acceptable. And they're going to justify their use of imperialism by citing or pointing out 3 key reasons why. First of all, they're going to cite the idea of balance of power. Now, if you don't remember from Unit 4, Imperialism, balance of power talked about bully countries being afraid that if they didn't bully victims, then they would kind of become weak compared to bully countries that were constantly bullying victims. And so balance of power is the idea of, I have to bully victims in order to stay a top dog bully, otherwise I'll become a weak bully, fall behind, and eventually be bullied myself. Japan believed that if it didn't bully others, it would fall behind on the chain of bullying. The second reason why Japan believed its imperialism was justified was because they had nationalistic ideas, meaning an intense amount of pride in Japanese culture, and they also had social Darwinist ideas. Again, social Darwinist is a term that we learned during Unit 4 in Imperialism, and social Darwinist is the idea that certain races are better than others and that there's scientific proof to this racist claim. And so not only did the Japanese have immense pride in their own culture, but they also believed that scientifically they were better than other countries. Finally, Japan also had the need for raw materials in order to continue industrialization. We learned in Unit 4, Imperialism, and Unit 3, Industrial Revolution, that sometimes countries become bullies because they don't have enough raw materials like cotton, steel, oil, or wood. And in order to get these natural resources, they often steal them from other countries, bring them back to their own nations, and use them in their own factories in order to continue creating production and money. A perfect example of some of the raw materials that Japan did not have a lot of were oil and iron. If we take a look at the map, we can see that Japan is an island, and islands often come with very limited land, which also means they have limited resources. So island nations will often try to practice imperialism in order to make up for the fact that they have limited resources due to limited land. Now, because of this, because they wanted to practice imperialism, Japan came into a tremendous amount of conflict with other countries around it. So let's take a look at this new bullet point. Because of this, conflict has been occurring in the Pacific theater long before the official start of World War II. So the people who believe that World War II started before Poland's invasion will point out that as early as 1931, Japan was already practicing this aggressive imperialism due to these 3 reasons. Specifically, a lot of people in Asia will say that in 1931, when Japan, the island nation, invaded China's city of Manchuria, that officially, and the invasion of Korea, we can see Korea here. So here's Korea. Korea was invaded by Japan. Here's China. The city of Manchuria was invaded by Japan. We can see Manchuria, China up here. This is the action many people believe starts World War II in the Pacific theater. Now, let's take a look at some of those aggressive actions that the Japanese are taking against China. In order to meet their economic and industrial needs, Japan officially declared war on China in 1937 and invaded. So in 1931, Japan had started bullying, but they did not officially invade China until 1937. Japanese nationalism, meaning pride, led them to believe that Japan could easily defeat China. And so the Japanese went into this 1937 invasion pretty cocky. Now, the United States at this point in time is not in any way, shape, or form involved in World War II. They are practicing their isolationism, meaning that they are pretty much turning their backs on the problems in Europe, the problems in the Pacific Ocean, and they're pretty much taking the attitude of, this is not our problem. However, even though they're practicing isolationism, meaning this is not our problem, the United States was still very much against Japanese aggression in the Pacific, specifically Japan's aggression against China. And so the United States decided to show its disapproval for Japanese imperialism by responding to the Japanese actions. One of the things that the United States is going to do is they are going to place a lot of economic sanctions on Japan. An economic sanction is a fancy way of saying penalties that hurt someone's economy. Here's an example of some of the economic sanctions, some of the penalties that the United States put against Japan. The first thing the United States did was the United States refused to continue providing Japan with loans. The United States also refused to continue trading and selling resources to Japan. Finally, the United States decided that any items that were sent to Japan would come at a very, very expensive increased fee, meaning Japan would have to pay more money now for any items it did acquire from the United States. These three economic sanctions which the United States placed against Japan were done in hopes that these economic sanctions would stop or at least convince Japan to stop practicing imperialism against China and also against the countries in the Pacific theater. Let's go ahead and pause our podcast. You should be able to find a link to video 1. This link is going to go over some really good important details on Japan's aggression. For this video, you are only going to watch the first 3 minutes. So once you click on the link for the video, either in this podcast description or back in Google Classroom, once you click the link, make sure that you're watching the timer for the video and that you're only watching the first 3 minutes. You can ignore the remainder of the video. So now that Japan has had a lot of economic sanctions placed against it, let's see what Japan decides to do. Unfortunately for Japan, their cockiness proved wrong. It was not that easy for them to take over China. Chinese resistance was strong, and Japan was struggling to defeat China. This placed an even further strain on Japan's economy and resources. So imagine this. We know that Japan is a tiny island. It's trying to take over China in order to gain more and more resources, and it's not able to defeat China. And on top of that, the United States has now placed a ton of economic sanctions against it. And so Japan is really suffering from like 2 back-to-back blows on its economy. As a solution to this problem, the Japanese decided to spread their imperialism practices. They decided to go ahead and bully new countries, specifically to bully the countries that were controlled by Europeans. And so if we take a look here at this map, we can see here all of these different colors represent different European bully countries. We have the British, the Dutch, the French, the Spanish, the Portuguese. And if we take a look here at what's known as Southeast Asia, we can see that all these different Southeast Asian countries are pretty much the victims of either the British, the Dutch, the French, the Portuguese, or the Spanish. Now, even though these victim countries are technically already owned by a bully, Japan decides it does not care. Japan decides that it's going to go and it's going to steal these victim colonies. It's going to steal them away from the European bullies that already own them. This is how Japan is going to fix this double whammy economic crisis it's facing from United States sanctions and also from not being able to take over China as quickly as they thought. With almost all of Europe conquered by Germany, the United States was the only nation capable of combating Japanese aggression in the Pacific theater. So, if we remember from the last lecture on Unit 7.2, pretty much all of these bully countries here in Europe, all of these countries have pretty much already been taken over by Hitler because of Blitzkrieg. And so these bully countries are not able to come down to Southeast Asia. They're not able to defend their victim countries. They're not able to stop Japan from taking them. The only country that has not been conquered and the only country that still is able to do something about this Japanese aggression is going to be the United States. But the United States is still practicing isolationism. They are still refusing to get involved in an issue they don't believe is their problem.